Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be talking about developing effective learning habits.
Ooh, this is a good one.
It is a good one. And to kind of narrow the scope a bit, we're going to be focusing on routine and discipline as part of that.
I like it. Routines and discipline. Sometimes those words can sound a bit restrictive.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I don't want to be disciplined. But when you look at the sources you've pulled together, it's actually quite the opposite.
Yeah. I'm excited to dig into these sources. We've got a guide that's specifically designed for Filipino learners, which I think will give us a very interesting perspective.
Yeah.
And then we've got some articles on self-discipline exercises, daily habits, research on willpower. We've even got some stuff on how routines impact the brain.
It's like we're going to kind of put together all these pieces of the puzzle to see what makes an effective learner.
Exactly. And the goal here isn't just to, you know, lay out the pieces of the puzzle, but really help you, the listener, figure out how to apply this to your own life.
I like that. Actionable.
Yes. We're not just theorizing here. We are going to be trying to come up with some things that you can put into practice.
Love it.
All right, so one of the things that really jumped out at me from the get-go was this concept of decision fatigue.
Oh, yeah. Decision fatigue.
Yeah, and it's something that I know I've experienced, and I bet a lot of our listeners have too.
For sure.
You know that feeling when you've had to make like a million tiny little decisions all day long, and by the end of the day, your brain is just fried?
Totally.
Even choosing what to have for dinner feels like a monumental task.
And what's fascinating is that Develop Discipline and Build a Daily Routine talks about how all of those tiny little decisions actually drain our mental energy.
Oh, interesting.
And that leaves us with less willpower, less focus for the things that actually matter, learning, absorbing new information, those kinds of things.
It's like our brain has this limited supply of decision-making fuel, and by the end of the day, we're running on fumes.
Exactly. And so then, it's no wonder it's so difficult to concentrate after a day full of, all those little decisions. But I think this is where it gets really fascinating because there's this other piece exploring the evidence base, the role of routines in creating an effective learning environment. And it connects this idea of decision fatigue to how our brains actually work.
Oh, Oaks is like a more scientific perspective on it.
Yeah, like a neurological perspective.
Interesting.
So the research suggests that when we establish routines, we're essentially automating a lot of those everyday decisions.
Makes sense.
And by doing that, it actually frees up our prefrontal cortex.
Ah, so that's the part of the brain that's responsible for planning, making decisions.
Exactly. Complex behavior, working memory, all of that.
So instead of wasting all of that precious brain power on what to wear or what to have for breakfast, we can actually channel that into learning.
You got it. It's like a cognitive hack, almost.
I like that.
And this is especially crucial for younger learners whose prefrontal cortexes are still developing.
Right. Makes sense. I mean, think about the impact that has in a classroom setting.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Where focus and attention are so important.
For sure. Okay, so let's kind of shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the practical advice for building a really solid foundation for learning.
Sounds good.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting was this guide, Cultivating Success, a guide to developing effective study habits for learners. Lots of good stuff in there.
Yeah, what stood out to you?
Well, for starters, the importance of having a consistent study schedule.
Oh, that's so important.
I know, it sounds very basic, but I know from my own experience it is really easy to let things slide
Totally.
when you don't have that dedicated time for it.
Yeah, and what's interesting about having a consistent schedule, like you said, reduces procrastination, but it also creates a rhythm for your brain.
Oh, interesting.
Right, like it's setting this internal alarm clock that tells your mind, okay, it's time to focus, it's time to learn.
I like that. Yeah. The other thing that I thought was really important in this guide was the idea of setting realistic goals for each study session.
Oh, for sure.
So instead of, being completely overwhelmed by this giant mountain of material that you have to get through,
Right.
you break it down into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Exactly, and that's where that self-discipline comes in,
That
right?
could be part of it.
Yeah, the ability to stay focused, resist distractions, make consistent progress towards those goals.
Yeah. And, before we even jump into the self-discipline thing, there was one other thing that I thought was really important that they talked about in cultivating success, And that is the idea of having a conducive study environment.
A good study environment. Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Because think about it, your physical space, your environment, it has a huge impact on your mental state.
Yeah.
If you're trying to learn in this cluttered space, all this noise around you, your brain is fighting this uphill battle.
So it's not just about having your materials and a good plan. It's really about creating a space that helps you learn.
Exactly. Intentional with your space,
Hmm.
minimizing distractions, setting the stage for focus. I love that.
All right, so let's circle back to this idea of self-discipline,
All right, let's do it.
because I feel like this is where it starts to get really interesting.
It does,
Because
yeah.
we're not talking about, external factors like a schedule or environment anymore. We're really talking about that internal drive.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, that internal drive that fuels our learning. Self-discipline, it's the engine.
It's what keeps us going.
It keeps us going, exactly. Even when the motivation dips or when things get tough.
And you've brought some really great sources that actually give us some really good advice and tips for building this self-discipline.
Yeah, there's a lot of great resources out there.
So we've got 7 daily habits to help you build self-discipline. And then we've also got 17 self-discipline exercises to help build self-control. So should we dig into some of those next?
Let's do it. All right, let's dig in. One thing that I noticed in both of those sources was this emphasis on setting small daily goals.
Oh, yeah. I love that idea.
It's so much less daunting,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Than like trying to tackle this massive long-term goal.
Yeah, you got to break it down into these bite-sized pieces.
Exactly. And, the articles talk about how those small wins, they're so crucial for building momentum.
Right. You get that sense of accomplishment.
Yeah, you feel good. You're like, okay, I can do this. And then you're more motivated to keep going.
It's all about consistency.
Absolutely. And, speaking of things that can kind of throw us off track, it's these distractions
Oh, tell me about it. They're everywhere.
everywhere.
Mhm.
And both 7 daily habits and the 17 self-discipline exercises,
Mm-hmm.
they really emphasize this idea of like identifying those triggers,
Yeah.
the things that distract you, and then coming up with strategies to minimize them.
So it's like personalized, right? What gets you off track may not be the same thing that gets me off track.
Exactly. So if social media is your downfall, what are you going to do? Silence those notifications, put your phone in another room, maybe use one of those website blockers during study time.
Create some boundaries for yourself.
Yes. Set yourself up for success. And yeah, this goes back to what we were saying earlier about that study environment.
Yeah, it's all connected.
It's all connected. It's all part of the puzzle.
And the other thing that I thought was really insightful was just being honest with ourselves about our weaknesses.
Yeah.
Whether that's procrastination or, you have trouble concentrating or whatever it is, you're more likely to be distracted by.
Knowing yourself, that self-awareness.
Yeah, like that's the first step to actually overcoming those things.
Exactly. Once you know what your patterns are, then you can come up with some strategies.
So, for example, if you're a procrastinator like me,
Yeah.
maybe break down those tasks into even smaller steps. Or maybe you use a timer, like those Pomodoro timers, to just work in little bursts.
Those are great strategies. Love those. And speaking of, the whole getting started piece and that willpower that we need, one of the sources you shared, 17 self-discipline exercises.
Yeah.
It actually delves into the science behind self-control.
Oh, cool.
And it talks about this concept called ego depletion. Have you heard of this?
I have heard of that.
So it basically suggests that willpower is like a muscle, and it gets tired after exertion.
So you can only use so much of it before.
Exactly. So the more decisions we make, the more willpower we exert throughout the day, the more depleted those reserves become, and then boom.
It's harder to resist those temptations.
Harder to focus.
Yeah.
It's that feeling of mental exhaustion we were talking about.
So it's not that we're lacking in character or discipline necessarily. It's just that we have a limited supply of mental energy.
Exactly. We got to manage it wisely.
Okay, but here's what I think is really interesting, is that the article also presents some counter evidence to this theory. Yeah, so it talks about how motivation and beliefs also play a big role in sustaining self-control.
So it's not just about having enough willpower, it's about believing that you can do it.
Yeah, believing in yourself, having that strong sense of purpose that drives you forward.
I love that. So it's not just this finite resource that we're stuck with.
Yeah.
It's about cultivating that motivation, strengthening your beliefs, connecting your goals to something bigger.
And speaking of finding what works best for us, this whole idea of reflection and adaptation also came up in a lot of the sources.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And this one really resonates with me. The Filipino Learner's Guide in particular talks about Being willing to adapt our strategies.
Oh, that's a good point.
What's working, what's not working. It's like we're constantly experimenting with our own learning.
Yeah, you're becoming your own learning scientist.
Exactly. And daily habits, the key to self-discipline, takes us a step further, right?
Hmm.
It talks about understanding your discipline style.
Oh, yeah, your discipline style.
What does that even mean?
So basically, it's about recognizing if you're more of a moderation person,
Okay.
finding that balance, or if you're more of an abstinence person.
Like you just avoid temptations altogether.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this can really impact how you approach learning and self-control. So like if you know you struggle with moderation, you might need to set really strict boundaries for yourself.
Yeah, keep those temptations out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. And this brings us to, the last piece of the puzzle, which is the role of community and external support.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that one.
Because daily habits talks about this idea of peer pressure, but like in a positive way.
So peer pressure can actually be a good thing.
It can. So the idea is that surrounding yourself with other disciplined people
Okay.
can actually encourage you to stay on track with your own goals.
So it's like this positive reinforcement.
Exactly, like a built-in support system.
Think about the people you spend the most time with.
Yeah, who are you hanging out with?
Do they inspire you to learn and grow?
Mm.
Or do they make it easier to slip back into those bad habits?
Yeah, it's like, if you're trying to climb a mountain, you want to have a good team with you.
Totally. A support system.
And, now is the time to instill habits that create lifelong learners, kind of digs deeper into this. And it talks about how our social environment can actually shape our learning habits.
Interesting.
So it talks about things like context cues, rewards, and social support.
Oh, break those down for me.
Yeah, so context cues are kind of like those environmental triggers that remind you to do something.
Okay.
So like having that designated study space, that's free of distractions.
Yeah,
It's like a signal to your brain, okay, this is where we learn.
Makes sense.
Or even setting reminders on your phone to, review material or something like that.
It's like building that association, right?
Exactly. And then rewards, those can be really powerful motivators.
Oh, for sure. Even small rewards.
Even small rewards. So, allowing yourself to do something you enjoy after a good study session.
Like a little treat.
Exactly. It reinforces those positive habits.
That's like a little pat on the back.
Yeah. And then social support is kind of like an extension of that, right?
Yeah. So having a study buddy or a mentor.
Yeah. Someone to check in on your progress.
Accountability.
Yeah. It's like you're sharing that learning journey with other people.
It's like having a team.
It is. It makes it more enjoyable, more sustainable.
Wow, this has been such a great deep dive.
I know. I've learned so much.
Me too. We've talked about the science behind routine and discipline, practical strategies, the role of community. It's amazing how much we've covered.
It is. And I think, the biggest takeaway for me is that becoming a better learner, it's not about some innate talent.
Right.
It's really about understanding how your brain works, being self-aware.
Yeah, finding what works for you.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Implementing strategies that fit your style, your preferences, and just recognizing that learning is a journey.
It is.
It's not a destination.
One thing that's really resonated with me throughout this whole conversation is just how interconnected all these pieces are.
Yeah.
Routine supports self-discipline. Self-discipline helps you stick to the routine. And then having that supportive environment, it all comes together.
This is a beautiful synergy.
It really is.
Yeah.
So as we kind of wrap things up here, is there any final thought or piece of advice that you would like to leave our listeners with?
I would just encourage everyone to think of these strategies not as like rules,
Yeah.
but as a starting point, experiment. See what works for you, adapt them to your own style, your own goals, and remember, learning should be fun.
It should be.
So be curious, be persistent, and embrace that whole, transformative power of knowledge.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive.
This is great.
It was fun. And to our listeners, we encourage you to check out the sources that we talked about and start your own journey, developing those effective learning habits, because it's a lifelong adventure and the possibilities are truly limitless.
So true.
Until next time, happy learning, everyone.